Hello and welcome to Codex Lee. My name is Lee and this is a channel all about books. Before I begin my review of Dune today, just to let you know that I'll be talking about the Reading Places project at the end of this video, so if that's something that you are interested in, then stay tuned. Anyway, without further ado, let's talk about Dune. In the week before their departure to Arrakis, when all the final scurrying about had reached a nearly unbearable frenzy, an old crone came to visit the mother of the boy, Paul. These are the opening words of Dune, and I'm going to be talking about the book with some spoilers today, so be warned. So Dune is sometimes compared to The Lord of the Rings in the sense that Frank Herbert, like J.R.R. Tolkien before him, enriches his societies and landscapes in this book with a level of detail that was kind of unprecedented for sci-fi at the time, in the same way that it was for fantasy when Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings. Like The Lord of the Rings, it has a sense of grandeur and a detailed historical backdrop that we only really get glimpses of in the book. And it opens with our young hero being visited by an old sage before commencing on a transformative journey. Dune is ultimately a sci-fi, but it's not the kind of sci-fi that you'd expect, not the kind of sci-fi I really expected. I had seen the David Lynch film prior to reading this, so I kind of knew the broad outlines of the story, but it's still surprising to read this and to realise that there are no robots, there's no artificial life in this book. There are references to the fact that there did used to be that kind of technology, but it doesn't exist in this world. There are spaceships, there is space travel, but we don't experience that as a reader. It's just kind of vaguely referenced at various different points. And the characters are all humanoids, with the exception of the giant worms, and we'll get back to them. Dune is a story about men and women who are either trying to take power or to retain power. So what is Dune exactly? When you describe the plot today, it sounds very familiar. Maybe it was familiar to readers back in 1965 when Dune was first published. But essentially it's about our young hero whose mentor is killed by his enemies, and he's forced to go on this great transformative journey and to prove himself among a group of oppressed people in order to take on the tyrannical forces in league against him. Now, if that sounds like the plot to Star Wars, Avatar, Harry Potter, that's because it is. For those of you who know your Joseph Campbell, this is the archetypal hero's journey as described in his seminal work, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. To quote from Campbell, "A hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man." Now, I'm not drawing attention to these conventions in order to dismiss or belittle Dune in any way. I really enjoyed reading this book, and I'm really excited about the new film adaptation which is coming out later this year. And even though Dune adheres to a lot of these conventions, Herbert cleverly subverts many of them as well. So Paul sort of glimpses the path before him as he accrues these godlike powers as the story goes on, and what he sees is a sort of a megalomaniac essentially leading a band of religious zealots in perpetual warfare across the universe. And although Paul's mentor, his father Leo Atreides in this case, dies fairly on in the book, Paul doesn't actually seem that bothered by it. His mother Jessica is certainly much more bothered by it, and you might actually argue that Paul's true mentor is Jessica rather than his father. What I particularly loved about Dune in the early parts is the political intrigue. So each scene early on presents us with various different characters with hidden motives and characters who are trying to discern those motives. And particularly Jessica and Paul, who use their, and I'm probably pronouncing this wrong, Bene Gesserit training in order to read into the smallest gestures and intonation of voice to understand what people are actually thinking. And the statecraft that unfolds is really dramatic. The real drama unfolds in sort of the inner monologues of these characters, and we jump between different perspectives within each chapter. And the tension throughout the whole thing is actually only heightened by the fact that Herbert makes no mystery of the fact that the Atreides family, the House of Atreides, is going to be betrayed, and by whom. The tension actually comes from the fact that we don't know when this is going to happen, and we don't know how it's going to happen. And when it does happen, it is actually quite shocking and very decisive. There's also no mystery about who or what Paul will become. I kind of found this a bit of an odd decision at first, that just so much of the future world involving these characters is outlined to us before we read about greater detail in the book itself. But I think I realised, as I began to read more of it, that it sort of heightens the near mythological status of what we're reading, as if this is some kind of great chronicle of great historical events. And so it's less important really to understand what happens than why it happened the way that it did. All of this makes Dune a very serious book, with little room for humour and intimacy. And I do feel that that is perhaps one of his weaknesses, but then I also wonder whether the introduction of humour and intimacy between characters would sort of lessen the impact of what Herbert is trying to achieve with this. What about the giant worms? The giant worms don't really appear until later in the book. There is an incident earlier on, but they kind of appear more frequently later in the book. I'm sure that they will look suitably impressive on the big screen, but reading about them in the book, I wasn't quite so taken with the idea. They didn't really represent a great threat. I mean, there is a physical threat from them, and there's a need to avoid them, but it's made clear early on as Paul and Jessica encountered the Freemen, who are the nomads who live within the desert, survive in the desert. The Freemen have already mastered a way of travelling using these worms. They know how to essentially control them, so that really reduces the sense of threat and the sense of awe, really, that you experience in reading about these things. And Paul's prescient insights reveal that he'll have little struggle in controlling them himself when the time comes as well. Speaking of Paul's growing omniscience, I think this is one of the main reasons why the later part of the book was less interesting to me than the earlier parts. Paul plays a bigger role in later parts, whereas the perspectives that, to me anyway, seem to dominate in the earlier parts tend to be his father, Leo Atreides, and his mother, Jessica, who's not actually Leo's wife. She's his consort, which is a political choice that seems to be made between them. Once Paul encounters the Freemen, there's a sense of inevitability almost to what happens. That's partly because he is, signposting what is going to occur as he sees that future for himself, but also because, as I said, the outlines of this sort of story are quite familiar to us now. There's little sense as well that Paul is ever really in danger. There are various different points where he seems to be at risk, but he always overcomes those challenges, and that's no real great surprise. So I feel that Paul's ascension to sort of reverential status is just far less interesting than the great betrayal that occurs early in the book. And that's partly because I just find Paul a less interesting character than his father. And also because in these later chapters, Jessica begins to fade a lot more into the background as Paul takes on more of a leading role. And I think that she's a much more interesting character to spend time with. Dune doesn't start off as Paul's story, but I think that it definitely becomes his story as the chapters progress, which is a shame, I think, because the more time I spend with Paul, the less that I like him. What I really wanted from this was a compelling protagonist, because the forces in league against Paul and his family and the Freemen are so utterly despicable. I mean, Herbert goes to great lengths to show how horrible the Harkonnens are, and even the Empire, and the elite forces of the Empire. They are pretty sadistic, and so I want a compelling protagonist to root for as he's going up against them. But instead what we get is this sort of arrogant teenager leading a band of religious zealots. And so it kind of leaves me feeling a little bit conflicted. Not that, don't get me wrong, that does make for an intriguing deconstruction of the myth of the hero, but as a sci-fi romp, it does leave something to be desired. But don't let me put you off reading this book. I really enjoyed it. I gave this 4 stars. And it's a finely crafted example of kind of a problematic hero's journey, which is also very interested in the dynamics of power. And it's also very, very interested in how ecological constraints shape societies. Dune is a book, I feel, that prioritizes the ideas that it's trying to communicate above the characters and plot that act as the framework for these ideas. And it does lose something in that regard. But there's no denying the sheer alien reality that Herbert has constructed, which is very compelling, and I enjoyed spending time in this particular world. It's not exactly Lord of the Rings in space, but if you're interested in Tolkien more for the subtext than the storylines, then you will really enjoy Dune. So, I hope you enjoyed that review, and as I said at the start of the video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Reading Places project here. So, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Reading Places project, I will put a description of it in the description box down below, and I will also put a link to the introductory video I made in a card above. But in a nutshell, the idea behind this was that I would randomly choose a place from a list of 200 places each month, and then the following month, I would read about that place and share with you what I'd learned about that place. The project was due to kick off in March. I was going to start reading about the first place in March, but I'm putting this project on hold indefinitely. The fact of the matter is that now is not a good time for me to start a big ambitious reading project like this for various different reasons. One of them is I've started a new job recently, and it's had more of an impact on my time and energy than I thought that it would. There are also mental health issues that I'm struggling with at the moment that make it quite difficult to commit to something like this. And also, I'm still kind of relatively new to BookTube. I'm still finding my voice. I'm still finding a way of doing this, not just the way of speaking to you as an audience, but also the technical side of things as well. I'm still getting used to, and I'd like to build more of an audience as well as I grow into my own a little more before committing to something like this. So I think I was a little bit premature in launching it, but hey-ho, we learn from our mistakes. But before you switch off, I'm not abandoning the idea completely. So I'm not going to be reading places, but I will be reading a place, namely my home country, the place where I was born, Wales. I do own several books about Wales that I want to read, and some that I have read that I like to reread. I'd also like to read fiction about Wales, fiction set in Wales as well. There's quite a lot of Welsh fiction that I've never read. Some of this fiction is written in English and some of this fiction is written in Welsh. I was taught in the Welsh language when I was at school, at primary school and secondary school. I was taught in Welsh, so I can technically speak Welsh. But having lived outside of Wales for so many years, I'm nowhere near as fluent in it as I was. But of course, I'm hoping that the more I read in Welsh, the better I'll become at understanding Welsh. So in the near future, expect to see more videos from me about Wales, books about Wales, books written in Welsh, and also books that are translated into Welsh, so popular books written in English originally, translated into Welsh. I'm interested in the experience of reading tales I'm already familiar with in the Welsh language. And one of those is definitely going to be Harry Potter. Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone was translated into Welsh, and I do have a copy of that, so I'm excited about reading that. So I hope that sounds interesting to you, so stay tuned for those videos. But in the meantime, thanks so much for watching, and as we say in Wales, hwyl fawr am nawr.